This is a presentation for the Charlotte Future 2040 Comprehensive Plan. The presentation was given at workshops that occurred on October 8th and 9th, 2019. The agenda at those workshops included a brief overview of Charlotte Future 2040, a review of the schedule and process for the overall planning effort, Phase 1 outcomes, Phase 2 results of the Growing Better Places game, and an important component of Phase 2 being the preliminary growth scenarios that will ultimately feed into a preferred scenario. We will wrap up with a couple of next steps. For those of you who are new to the process, a comprehensive plan guides our growth to achieve the physical structure we want in Charlotte in 20 years. It's a combination of policy and direction for growth and development, as well as our capital investments. It is meant to unify many current and future efforts in Charlotte. The process actually began in winter of 2018, looking at our history and existing conditions, and then proceeded into the spring to talk about community vision and values. We are now in Phase 2, well on our way to completing Phase 2, and we will ultimately result in a preferred scenario for future growth, leading into winter of 2019. Phase 1 outcomes included a vision and goals framework. That included guiding principles of authentic, equitable, and integrated, 5 vision elements: inclusive and diverse, livable and connected, healthy and sustainable, prosperous and innovative, and regional, and a set of 8 goals that are intended to support each of those vision elements. The plan itself will ultimately be organized around the vision elements, and the intent is that most, if not all, recommendations would help us move forward in realizing the vision and achieving our goals. Phase 2 is focused on scenario planning. We use scenarios to help us make more informed decisions about our future, consider future issues and challenges, estimate likely effects of different growth patterns and development patterns, and better understand the impacts and trade-offs of our choices, so that ultimately we can have fewer unintended consequences of how and where we grow, and hopefully right some of the wrongs of the past. In order to get community feedback throughout the summer, we developed and deployed a Growing Better Places board game focused on creating a more equitable and inclusive Charlotte. The purpose was to explore those impacts and trade-offs of growth and gather valuable community input using a fun, non-traditional activity when it is often more difficult to get input during the summer months. The input is being used in looking at the strategy choices that people made, as well as tile and other game token placement on the game board to understand how and where people thought we should grow, and we fed this into the alternative growth scenarios. Over 1,800 people participated in the growth game, with approximately 840 in person and nearly 1,000 online. A really great aspect of the game was all the publicity surrounding it, and we estimate that 44,000 people became aware of the game and, more importantly, of the comprehensive plan process because of its publicity and deployment throughout the community. Looking at the game results, we'll break it into 2 categories. First, looking at the different growth strategies that people responded to. In person, a group discussed these growth strategies and had to choose at least one related to each of the vision elements. Online, which was an individual exercise, people kind of thumbs up or thumbs down each strategy, so they were independently evaluated. When we compared the results online and in person, we saw some similarities and some differences. Leading with some of the similarities, people favored several strategies, both online and in person, including investing in another high-capacity transit corridor, adding goods and services in more neighborhoods, reducing pressure on neighborhoods with high-intensity residential and activity centers, meaning that if we could focus some of the additional growth that we expect in terms of households into mixed-use centers in strategic areas, that may reduce the development pressure on existing neighborhoods and residences. And the fourth area of commonality was investing in bike and pedestrian improvements around the community. Looking at strategies that were favored in person, but maybe a little more mixed online in examining the results, One was related to activity centers and this idea of having multiple strong activity centers outside of Uptown. When people played in person, they thought that it was a really great idea to try to grow these mixed-use activity centers in the north and east and west portions of the community to supplement what we have in Uptown and to the south in South Park and Ballantyne. And then the other, where it was a little mixed results, was duplexes and triplexes. In person, people favored allowing adequately sized lots in existing neighborhoods that may only allow single-family homes today to redevelop or maybe infill with duplexes and triplexes on line that was mixed. And a commonality in not favoring strategies online or in person included accessory dwelling units, which would be mother-in-law flats, small apartments in a kind of converted basement, or maybe an expansion of a home. And the strategy that was tested was relaxing the strict development standards required for ADUs, accessory dwelling units, to reduce the barriers to their construction. And people tended to not favor that. And in the written comments, we heard that people wanted to know more about how those would be relaxed. It was very important to them that the quality of development in neighborhoods was maintained. And so they said it might be worth looking at still, but we'd want to know exactly how those would be relaxed. And finally, industrial development, encouraging new industrial uses in other areas of the city, adjacent to major roadways that can support freight traffic. And that's because most of the existing development is in the west portion of the community. And so the idea was tested about trying to incentivize or in other ways promote industrial development in other portions of the community, north, east, south. And that strategy was not favored online or in person. We looked at where participants placed different development tiles as well as amenity tokens, and that pattern tended to reinforce existing distribution. We saw the most intensification in the west and the center, the least development intensification in the south. In the east and north, the development tended to follow transit investments as well as existing activity centers. And we saw well-distributed neighborhood nodes in all geographies. There were some differences of opinion in people who played the game about where the central area sort of met the western area, and also the nuances of the western geography that was used for gameplay. Part of that may have been related to the definition of central and the scale of that central area was relatively large in the game as compared to the existing center city. But regardless, people were putting a lot of tiles on the western portion of the kind of where the central and west meet, and you can see it in the map in the lower right. But were differing in opinion about what type of development they thought was most appropriate. And then also fewer activity centers and more neighborhood nodes where the players lived. So depending on where the game was being played, where people lived, they tended to focus the larger activity centers in other areas of town and focus on small-scale neighborhood nodes where they live. A neighborhood node would be a small commercial cluster. It could be just one intersection with a couple of shops, a restaurant. It might be a small main street of a block or two in length. But people wanted those close to home, not intense development. So we used all those game results to inform scenarios. And what we really want to use these growth scenarios to do is illustrate trade-offs of different types of growth. Test distinct examples of development patterns from the game input. So using that community input, some of the policies or strategies, and the growth patterns, and packaging those to test different development patterns. Identifying desirable patterns for growth in different areas. There may not be a one-size-fits-all solution. And linking back to the vision and goals framework, looking at some key indicators and metrics. And an important distinction that was emphasized in the workshop, and I'd like to emphasize here, is that we're not intending these scenarios to be standalone choices. Ultimately, what we want to hear are what are the pros and cons associated with each, so that we can craft a preliminary draft preferred scenario that would then be vetted with the community again before landing on a final preferred scenario. We created 4 scenarios for this initial set of growth scenarios: a business as usual, reflecting existing adopted policy and market trends, and 3 additional: a strong centers, connected corridors, and neighborhood nodes. In allocating the place types across the city, what we were doing was basically allowing different types of development to happen. It would be closest to changing the zoning in different areas. But then the model itself, and the model being community viz, allocates housing units and jobs across the city depending on where they're allowed based on a number of factors. Market readiness, how strong the market is in certain areas, land values, looking at existing infrastructure, as well as a variety of other factors that tend to attract or not attract development. The business as usual scenario, when mapped, we did that in 3 different ways. A concept sketch that showed that generally it focuses on a handful of corridors, the major regional center in the middle with Uptown, and a variety of other centers around the community. We also then mapped that similar to what the game board looked like with different places. We then tried to highlight, because that's a little difficult to read, the changes from existing places, and you can see that pattern in the middle graphic there. When we tested that using the model, we saw that it had the highest amount of new housing close to goods and services. In fact, it was tied with the neighborhood node scenario, but both of those scored the highest. Highest percentage of new single-family detached housing, highest cost to serve public schools with infrastructure, and the highest share of auto trips in new development and highest air quality impacts. Those last 3 bullets are very closely aligned with each other, correlated, because business as usual currently in Charlotte means a lot of single-family home development on the periphery. That comes with extra costs to provide infrastructure and schools, and can have negative impacts on air quality. Looking at the strong center scenario, you can see the concept sketch on the left, the full scenario on the right, and when you look at the change from existing in the middle, a focus on trying to create stronger and larger nodes in the close-in south, but also east, north, and west portions of the city. That strong center scenario resulted in the most new housing and multifamily mixed-use development, the highest percent of development existing activity centers, lower amount of new housing close to goods and services, the lowest cost to serve public schools with infrastructure, but it does not really fully leverage existing and planned transit investment, because not all of those regional activity centers align with where the planned transit investment is. And finally, the benefits and challenges related to the most new growth being concentrated. So in some ways, it was good to concentrate that development. For those new housing units that would be developed in those strong centers, they had access to schools and goods and services and potentially jobs and open space. But for everyone else, the existing residents, the new housing that did not fit in those strong centers, there could be access issues and questions of equity. In the connected corridor scenario, we really attempted to follow that pattern informed by gameplay of focusing a lot of development along existing and planned high-capacity transit, being light rail and streetcar. So you can see much more linear development within those different scenarios, going along transit corridors as well as other mixed-use corridors. You'll also see that there's some multifamily sort of medium-density housing showing up in the southwest portion of this particular scenario. And it happened to be the scenario where we tested this idea, where we were seeing some differences of opinion in the game, of focusing on employment and industrial in the southern portion of the community versus focusing on maybe medium-density housing. When we tested that scenario, we saw the most new housing close to existing and proposed transit. No surprise there. But it also had the most new housing close to existing parks, which was unexpected. We didn't realize until running the scenario that a lot of the parks and open space and trails, in part because of some recent investments, but also because of the location of those transit investments, end up being close to these corridors. Unfortunately, it had the lowest amount of new housing close to goods and services, in part because of the disconnect between where how much housing could fit along those corridors and where the goods and services would be located, but also the misalignment in some cases of existing or proposed centers and corridors. Because of the high transit ridership, had the lowest air quality impacts, but because of the focus on corridors versus centers, had the less, or did have less residential development in existing activity centers, and tended to score in the middle on many other indicators. Finally, the neighborhood node scenario. This was an attempt at distributing small-scale commercial development as well as the increase in new housing across the entire community. So you'll see a much more scattered pattern, much more distributed pattern in the change from existing, as well as you're seeing some of the light yellow show up here. And that is because we tested that strategy of allowing duplexes and triplexes in places that may only allow single-family homes today. So these resulted in the highest amount of new housing close to goods and services. The housing was distributed, the new housing, as well as new goods and services, centers of a variety of sizes, neighborhood, community, and regional. Unfortunately, then, that came with the highest cost to serve public schools with infrastructure because the new residents were spread out so much that we would be having to perhaps expand existing schools or build new schools in places that are already built out and have a high cost of land. It had the most additional infrastructure required because our local streets in our neighborhoods are not necessarily designed or constructed to support the increased traffic that would be expected coming to these neighborhood nodes, these small commercial centers distributed throughout the community. And then the least new development in existing activity centers and the most balanced mix of new housing. In the workshop, we asked folks to help us understand better how these scenarios further the vision and goals. I will speak to in a couple of slides an opportunity to provide the similar input online. And we did that activity at the workshop where we reviewed the scenarios on a series of posters, had the opportunity to talk with staff, and then had a booklet that will be available to you online here in a moment. We did wrap that up with a group discussion and then asked for people to turn in those booklets, and we are using that input as well as what we will collect online to inform the preferred growth scenario. After the group discussion, we hit on a few next steps, but only after highlighting for folks that the scenario alone is not the entire comprehensive plan, and it cannot help us achieve our vision and goals alone. It will need to be supplemented with a robust policy framework, and so our next steps are to take all of this community input and refine a preliminary draft preferred scenario and highlight high-level key policies that will be necessary to achieve that scenario. Next steps during the workshop was highlighting some of the other workshops that were still coming up, but there are still pop-ups and online surveys throughout October. There will be a strategic advisor meeting in November where we're using community representatives from across the entire community to help to interpret input that we received during this phase of the process and to help craft that preferred scenario. And then you can sign up for updates at www.charlottefuture.com/2040. That is also where you can access the online input activity that is very similar to what was used in the workshop. Thank you so much.